another piece, we're going to make a slight shift here today, another piece of the puzzle in getting the world to truly act and come together and rally around addressing climate change is really understanding the data behind climate change and what that means. And next up on our stage today, we've got Robert Kirkpatrick from UN Global Pulse. And I don't know if you know the work of Global Pulse, but it is the UN entity that really takes a big, deep dive into data and helps understand all of the data that's out there in the world, pull it together into, as much as possible, into one resource, and use it to really understand what the hidden stories are behind some of the big changes that we see in the world, including climate change. So I'd like to welcome today to the stage Robert Kirkpatrick, who can tell you a little more about what they're doing with the data revolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. So I'm going to take you through a quick presentation here on the data revolution. Basically, we see big data as a natural resource, and I'm going to talk about sort of the implications of that. A natural resource that can be harnessed for public good. Next slide, please. So in 2013, the Secretary General convened a high-level panel to assess what was needed to achieve sustainable development. One of the findings of this was that we need a data revolution. Traditional approaches to collection of statistical data are no longer accurate and no longer adequate in a world in which change is happening at such an accelerated pace. 3 to 5-year-old statistics don't cut it anymore. And so the idea was we need to completely transform what kinds of data we use, how we collect it, better ways to make sure we know who's represented in it, and make sure there are better ways to make it accessible to those who can best use it. Next slide, please. So we've got 17 SDGs. There's no SDG specifically around data, but the place where you find most of the mentions of it is in 17. That's in partnerships. Now that's really appropriate when you look at a lot of the new data that's out there, what's called big data, because it's in the hands of private sector, right? Which means you cannot access it and use it for development without new kinds of public-private partnerships. Next, please. Now, here, what I'm going to be talking about specifically today is SDG 13, which is climate. And this is interesting, of course, because this SDG touches all of the others. The climate is the container for all of the work where this is happening on the SDGs. And I think it's interesting because we see work in climate as the best possible starting point for thinking about new ways to use data, because you're going to touch all of the other work in the process. In particular, I'll close by talking about what we're doing in the climate space around big data with a new campaign called Data for Climate Action. Next, please. So we live in this world now where people are producing a vast amount of information just by going about their daily lives. As we buy and sell goods, as we search for information on the internet, communicate through phones, share our lives through social networks, and search, we're producing huge amounts of information. In a very real sense, the data revolution isn't something that needs to happen. It's already happening. It's already well underway, and it's completely transforming private sector. The question is, how can we harness all of that information and all of the innovation around it for development purposes? Next. What you see here is an advertisement from IBM from 2010 with their chief data scientist, Jeff Jonas, standing at a busy intersection, and he asked the question, would you cross the street based on data that was 10 minutes or 5 minutes old, right? That's the mentality that private sector has now. This idea that the competitive edge, to maintain the competitive edge, you have to be able to turn what your customers are saying and doing in real time into better business decisions than the competition. So their mentality is already one in which it's all about real time. It's all about living in that world of constant change. This is a mentality that we certainly need to adopt in public sector. Next. So this is you can see here kind of a metaphor for how we think about the difference between, say, survey data and what's new about big data. You know, real-time information isn't just faster, it's different. It allows a qualitatively different type of understanding, in particular because for the first time in history, we have an empirical base of evidence on human behavior. You can observe human behavior unfold in real time in a way that's never been possible before. Next. And what are the implications of that? Well, once you acknowledge the complexity of the world we're living in and the increased pace of change, prediction gets really hard. What we're striving for in Global Pulse is to help move toward a world where it's at least possible to navigate effectively in the present. And having real-time information on what's happening around you as you implement your programs is really the focus of our work at Global Pulse. Next. So this is what we found is really interesting. Basically, when you look at all of the use of digital services out there, you know, mobile communications, mobile money services, all the services in the cloud, all the apps that are out there, what we find is that when people are using these kinds of technologies and services to meet their household needs, and when their household needs change, they change what they search for. They change what they buy and sell. They change what they share on social networks. And you can actually learn to recognize the signatures of people getting sick, of people losing their jobs, of a policy not working. So our work is really focused on beginning to understand the digital footprints that correlate with all 17 of these new goals. Next. So at Global Pulse, we are a special initiative of the Secretary General. Our mission is essentially to accelerate discovery, development, and adoption of innovations in data science using these new data sources for sustainable development and humanitarian action. We operate a network of data science innovation labs called Pulse Labs in partnership with UN agencies and governments. We have labs in New York, in Uganda, and Indonesia. Next. So if you think about the long-term vision, today any of you can go to dozens, probably hundreds of websites around the world and type in the name of a place, and you can get instantaneously real-time information on temperature, wind speed, barometric pressure, cloud cover. You can get forecasts over what's going to happen in the next few days and alerts if concerning patterns appear in that data. We're talking about moving toward a world in which we can do the socioeconomic equivalent of meteorology, right? In which one day you'll be able to go to a website somewhere and see for any village on Earth what's happening there in employment and gender equality, food security, and public health. So that's the world we're trying to get to. Next, please. So we recognized early in this endeavor, back in 2010 when the project started, that most of the data that was needed, unlike the world of the SDGs, where the data was all in the hands of government, most of this data is produced by people, it's collected by machines, and it's owned by private sector. Excuse me. So we began reaching out to different industries, the mobile industry, financial industry, around an idea we call data philanthropy, saying let's find a way for you to share some of the data that powers your business in a way that fully protects privacy, in a way that protects your business interests, but in a way that can still reveal useful information for policymakers. The response was overwhelming from the start. Lots of interest from businesses, a new approach to corporate social responsibility, and that has continued to grow over time. So I'm going to show you a few projects that we've done, a sample of the more than 40 we've done in the past couple of years using data sources through partnerships with private sector. Next slide, please. So this is an example. This is a project that we did with the World Food Program and mobile operator Telefonica in Mexico. There were floods in 2009. And we worked with World Food Program, and they said what we really want to be able to see is how populations affected by a disaster are displaced, and specifically, where have they been displaced to? Where can you see people gathering in need of assistance? Not because you sent the helicopters there to find where they were, but because we could actually observe their behavior as it happens. We use the anonymized data for the mobile phone network. As people are making calls through different cell towers or receiving text messages, you can actually use this information to plot the movement of a population in real time. And we were able to see the night of the floods where people had been displaced from and where they were gathering in need of assistance. So our vision is really to be able to use this type of information to build a piece of software that will run on the mobile networks of every operator in the world that could provide essentially real-time guidance for humanitarian logistics after disaster. Next slide. What you see here is an analysis that we were doing of where calls were happening during the floods. What we found is that in some areas where the rivers were rising, people were making lots of unusual levels of calls. That indicates that they're aware that there's something unusual happening around them. But in other areas, no one was making unusual calls. And that suggests they don't know the risks they're facing. So this could be a way to target public communications during an emergency. Next. Let's see. Next slide, please. We can get it to go there. We also use information from mobile operators to see how people move and potentially spread infectious disease. So from Pulse Lab Kampala, we've been working with the Ministry of Health and taking case data and movement data from the mobile networks and combining it. So if you can see people moving from areas where there's a current outbreak of a disease to new areas, you can alert health authorities in those new areas to be on the lookout for symptoms of that disease. Next slide, please. This is a project that we did in our lab in Jakarta, Pulse Lab Jakarta, and we essentially compared daily food prices from 30 cities in Indonesia, which the government collects, to Twitter. And we found that there were thousands of people on Twitter in Indonesia complaining about what they had to pay for rice and fish and chicken. We call this complainomics because we got nearly 90% correlations between what people complained about and the official prices. So this is a new way to calculate inflation, we think, in food price inflation, a new approach to food security monitoring. This was done with the World Food Program as well. Next, please. And finally, this is work that we've been doing with a new data source, which is radio. So when we look at a country like Uganda, you don't have a lot of people there who are on social media outside of the capital, Kampala. But what we have is 200 FM radio stations across the country. And the opportunity there is to turn that information in real time into something we can analyze. And so we've been using a 30-year-old technology, speech-to-text, dictation software, to turn call-in shows where farmers are calling in talking about their crops failing. You've got shows for new mothers, shows on domestic violence, HIV, and you can actually track trends across the country in multiple languages by seeing what people talk about publicly on the radio. Next slide, please. Yeah, and here you can see just a shot of the kind of thing that we're doing, spotting these different conversations. Next, please. We partner with the Universal Postal Union. We've got access to 5 years of all the records of all the packages transmitted between 198 countries. We don't know who they're from, but what you can see is it's a very strong way to understand GDP and trade flows using this new data source, a huge physical network. It's billions and billions of packages moving. And they're very different relationships between countries. Next, please. So just to wrap up, we've also been doing work in the climate space for a while. Last year, in preparation for the summit, we held the Big Data Climate Challenge, putting out a call for research that used big data as a new way to understand climate. We had 2 winners, and I want to show you these. We got over 60 entries in response. Next slide, please. This is from Global Forest Watch. They're using satellite imagery to track deforestation in real time. You can train artificial intelligence algorithms to recognize where the forests are being cut down and actually trigger alerts if a certain amount happens in a certain time. It's a very powerful tool for putting political pressure on those who are not protecting the forests. Next slide, please. The other winner was CIAT, Institute from Columbia. They used massive amounts of data on climate change to build the world's first smart system that's publicly available that can tell farmers when you should and should not plant crops, because you can actually predict the likelihood of those crops surviving. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, as I said, we view big data as a kind of new natural resource, right? There's this ocean of this stuff out there. It's infinitely renewable, but you could argue that it's fallen prey to an extractive industry, right? It's in an unregulated and opaque extractive industry in the eyes of many. Its benefits are not reaching those who need them most. The skills needed to unlock the value of the data are in the hands of the few. And while it is a renewable resource, it does bear some affinity to, let's say, nuclear power more than solar or wind. Its nature is to leak and contaminate. In the wrong hands, this information can cause great harm. So the challenge before us, similar to the dawn of the nuclear age, is how can we contain this stuff safely and responsibly? What is the innovation we need to do that and to ensure responsible use for the public good? Next slide, please. So we are here in Paris because we are putting out a call to companies through this campaign we call Data for Climate Action in partnership with the Secretary General's Climate Change Support Team, asking companies to kind of take data philanthropy to the next level and make anonymized and aggregated sets of data from their business data available to researchers around the world. Next year, we will be hosting a competition where they can come and compete for prizes in areas related to cities and energy and resilience, to develop solutions that can help communities around the world mobilize action on climate change. I would say, just to conclude, we spent a lot of time in the first couple of decades getting better data on the climate so that we could get to this moment. But now what we need is better data on human behavior, because it's us we need to change. How are we mitigating the effects? Are our public engagement strategies working? And how well are we adapting to this new world? So thank you very much. And I'll be around later on, so if you have any questions.